Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a deep, detailed look at a figure whose influence has, well, really defined so much of the 21st century global order. Vladimir Putin.
That's right.
We are using our sources here to try and map out his decades-long career, tracking his, frankly, remarkable ascent from a Cold War intelligence officer to the long-serving de facto leader of Russia.
And our mission really is to understand the anatomy of this kind of perpetual power. I mean, Putin has managed to stay at the helm of Russia since, 1999 or 2000?
Right.
Serving alternately as president, that was 2000 to 2008, and then again since 2012, and as prime minister in those years in between. It's a continuity of command that's, well, you just don't see it much in modern democratic systems.
No, you really don't. And the scale of this continuity, that's what truly demands this kind of deep dive, I think. If we look at those constitutional amendments he signed back in 2021, those changes basically reset his term limits. They allow him to run for election twice more.
Yeah.
Potentially, he could remain president until 2036.
Yeah, potentially.
I mean, that isn't just long-term leadership. It feels like systemic, perpetual power, almost by design.
Exactly. And those amendments, they weren't just about political longevity, They really codified his ideological framework and cemented this very centralized governing structure, which I think we really need to unpack.
Okay.
But just to set the stage, we have to immediately place his rule within its, let's say, contentious global context.
And that context shifted massively in 2023, didn't it?
It really did. In March 2023, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, issued an arrest warrant for Putin.
Right, the war crimes allegations.
Precisely. The warrant relates to alleged war crimes, specifically involving the illegal child abduction said to have occurred during the war in Ukraine. Now, this places an unprecedented legal cloud over a sitting G20 leader. It raises huge questions about his diplomatic future, international travel, everything.
Yeah, that sets a profoundly challenging tone for understanding his rule right from the outset. So when we look at the internal structure of power he actually built, how do the sources describe the political system under his watch?
Well, consistently and pretty uniformly, it's described as an authoritarian dictatorship.
Okay.
It's a political environment marked by some pretty profound challenges. Things like endemic corruption. Russia consistently scores exceptionally low on Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index.
Right.
It's also characterized by systematic human rights violations, the often violent suppression and imprisonment of political opponents, and critically, the absence of genuinely free and fair elections. Freedom House, for instance, has rated Russia consistently low, highlighting this massive democratic deficit that's really been built up during his tenure.
That's a powerful overview of where things stand now. So let's unpack the journey that brought him there. Let's start with Section 2, the ascent,
Right.
beginning in Leningrad in 1952.
Right. The beginning of his story is really essential because it's so deeply rooted in the Soviet apparatus. He was born in Leningrad, the youngest of 3 children. And there's this truly fascinating detail about his family background. His grandfather, Spiridon Putin, was apparently a personal cook to none other than Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin.
Wait, seriously? The grandson of Lenin's and Stalin's personal cook? That's not just, proximity. That's a lineage rooted right there in the kitchen of Soviet power.
It is quite something, isn't it?
How much did that history, that closeness to the inner circle, the actual mechanisms of state authority, how much do we think that shaped his early goals?
Well, it certainly connects his family directly to the foundational power structures of the Soviet state. But his early life was also marked by the very real physical scars of World War II on Leningrad, the siege.
Ah, yes.
Both his older brothers, Albert and Victor, died during the war. Victor died from diphtheria and starvation in 1942. His father was a conscript, served in an NKVD destruction battalion, and was severely wounded. So this generation's trauma, their service to the state, that really defines his background.
So a childhood shaped by that Soviet power, legacy, scarcity, state loyalty. Where did that path lead him academically?
He was known for being disciplined, quite focused. From the age of 12, he trained really intensively in martial arts, sambo, and judo, sort of embodying physical discipline. And academically, he pursued a pretty demanding track, graduating from the Leningrad State University Law Faculty in 1975.
And what was his academic focus? Was it policy or more towards law enforcement?
His thesis was actually focused on commercial regulation. The title was The Most Favored Nation Trading Principle in International Law.
Interesting.
During this time, of course, joining the Communist Party, the CPSU, was basically a requirement for any serious career advancement. He remained a member until that coup attempt in 1991.
Right.
And crucially, during his time at university, he met Anatoly Sobchak.
Ah, the mentor figure.
Exactly. Sobchak was teaching business law then. He'd later co-author the Russian Constitution, become mayor of St. Petersburg, a hugely influential mentor for Putin.
So the path from university led him straight into the legendary KGB. What defined his time in intelligence?
He joined the KGB right out of university in '75. After initial training, the 401st KGB school, he worked first in counterintelligence, that's the second chief directorate. Then he shifted to monitoring foreigners and consular officials in the first chief directorate.
Okay.
And then they suggest the Dresden office was politically kind of marginal, and his duties were pretty mundane. That he and his colleagues were reduced mainly to collecting press clippings because the KGB apparatus in East Germany was apparently quite ineffective by the late 80s.
Right. The narrative of the quiet, efficient, maybe even slightly bored, desk-bound agent. But then there's the other account, the darker, more conspiratorial one.
Precisely. There was investigative reporting alleging his office was actually involved in coordinating support for the terrorist Red Army faction, the RAF.
Wow.
The suggestion being that Dresden was used as a sort of discrete location for these clandestine activities, far from the political spotlight of Moscow or Berlin. Now, we have to be impartial here.
Of course.
A 2023 investigation apparently disputed the key anonymous source behind that RAF claim, labeling them a notorious fabulist. So the truth remains contested, but these conflicting stories, they definitely shape his mythos.
Regardless of what his day-to-day tasks actually were, the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 must have been a moment of, existential crisis for a KGB officer stationed right there.
Oh, undoubtedly. It was a defining moment. Putin himself has claimed that during the chaos, when demonstrators surrounded the KGB villa, he personally took action to protect state secrets.
How so?
He said he saved files from the nearby Soviet Cultural Center and, very strategically, burned only the most sensitive KGB files. He apparently sent many other documents back to Moscow, preventing them from falling into the hands of the angry crowds outside.
Yeah.
It's a story that underscores his claimed resourcefulness and, deep commitment to protecting the state apparatus, even as it was crumbling around him.
And the end of his intelligence career lined up almost perfectly with the end of the Soviet Union itself.
Yes, exactly. He resigned from the KGB in August 1991, specifically during the attempted coup against Gorbachev. He then returned to Leningrad State University and, crucially, renewed his vital friendship with his former law professor, Anatoly Sobchak.
And from this point, his political rise was just lightning fast. It's genuinely hard to overstate how quickly he went from being a mid-ranking intelligence officer to the head of the government.
It truly was an astonishing vertical ascent. Back in St. Petersburg, which was Leningrad when he started there, he worked in Sobchak's administration from 1990 to 1996.
Okay.
He started as an international affairs advisor, later headed the Committee for External Relations, overseeing foreign investment. This role put him directly in contact with Western businesses, right in the middle of that chaotic post-Soviet market economy.
But his time in St. Petersburg wasn't exactly clean, was it? What do the sources say about the controversies surrounding him then?
You're right. The sources do confirm his time there was marred by investigations, particularly concerning allegations of things like asset valuation manipulation and some questionable metal export licenses. Now, he was never charged, and he kept his post until Sobchak lost the mayoral election in '96. But the investigations suggest he learned very early on how to navigate that murky intersection of politics and, let's say, wealth management.
And that loss for Sobchak turned out to be Putin's political rocket fuel, didn't it? He left St. Petersburg for Moscow in 1996. Was this escaping the investigations or just pure political opportunity?
The sources really point towards pure, upward political ambition, facilitated by his connections. He was called to Moscow, brought into the Yeltsin administration, where he moved incredibly quickly through key administrative roles.
Like what?
Deputy chief of the Presidential Property Management Department, then chief of the Main Control Directorate, positions with real oversight.
And then the pivotal move came in 1998.
That's it.
Yeah.
In '98, Yeltsin appointed him director of the FSB, the main successor agency to the KGB. He spent about a year there, focusing intensely on strengthening the agency, really reestablishing the intelligence community as a central pillar of state power.
Okay.
Then, in August 1999, almost out of the blue, he was appointed prime minister. And just 4 months later, when Yeltsin resigned suddenly on New Year's Eve...
Putin became acting president.
Exactly, acting president.
So just to recap, Regional municipal advisor, the head of the FSB, to prime minister, then acting president, all in about 8 years. That trajectory, it leads us directly into Section 3, the vertical of power and economic realignment.
Right. The moment he effectively assumed power, his immediate focus domestically was centralization. He inherited this fragmented, pretty chaotic Russia where regional governors held immense power. He needed to build what he explicitly called the vertical, a strict top-down structure of control.
Okay. How did he achieve that administrative consolidation? What were the mechanics?
Well, his first key move was very early, May 2000. He issued a decree organizing Russia's 89 federal subjects regions, basically into 7 administrative federal districts. That number later expanded and got reorganized a bit.
And who ran these districts?
Each district was placed under the authority of a powerful presidential envoy. These envoys acted as Moscow's eyes and hands on the ground, making sure regional governments towed the Kremlin line.
So it sounds like he was systematically stripping away the independence that regional leaders had gained after the USSR collapsed.
That's exactly what it looks like. And the sort of final nail in the coffin for regional autonomy came in July 2000, when he gained the legal right to dismiss the heads of these federal subjects, the governors.
Wow.
And then, critically, in 2004, right after the Bislin school siege tragedy, he replaced the direct popular election of governors altogether.
How did that work?
It became a system where the president nominated the governor, and then the regional legislature simply confirmed the choice. Effectively, Moscow picked the governors.
And he justified this move, which, let's be clear, dismantled the key democratic mechanism by saying it was necessary to combat separatism and organized crime, right?
Yes, he framed it as essential for stability, for holding the country together. This centralization, it defines the political system he built, and the ideological framework they developed for this top-down control was termed sovereign democracy.
Sovereign democracy. What does that mean in practice?
Well, the idea, as presented, is that the government's actions must enjoy popular support within Russia and, crucially, be insulated from external, particularly Western, political influence or pressure.
I see.
But some critics, like the Swedish economist Anders Åslund, characterize this style quite differently, not as a system of modern governance, but as highly personalized, centralized manual management, like someone driving the whole country by hand.
That ability to control regional politics, that manual management, must have given him the leverage to then focus his centralized power on the next critical piece, the economy. How was the economy managed under this style?
Yeah, the economic policies under Putin are complex, and the economist Sergei Guriev, he actually divided them into 4 distinct periods, which I think is a really helpful way to understand how the state's role evolved over time.
Okay, walk us through those 4 phases.
Sure. First, Guriev identifies the reform period, roughly 1999 to 2003. This saw some initial structural changes, tax reform, some liberalization, which happened to coincide perfectly with the global resource boom.
Right place, right time.
Pretty much. Second, the status period, say 2004 to 2008. This is where the state really starts reasserting control over key industries, energy especially.
Okay.
Third, the crisis recovery period, 2008 to 2013, basically navigating the global financial crisis. And finally, the isolation stagnation period from 2014 to the present, largely driven by sanctions after the annexation of Crimea and then the full-scale invasion.
Let's focus on that initial reform period boom for a second. It's often held up as proof of his early effectiveness, isn't it?
It was certainly a boom, no question. But the key driver, according to most analyses, was largely external. During those first 8 years or so, the average GDP growth was an astonishing 7% per year.
Incredible numbers.
They are. And while some early economic reforms definitely played a part, the primary fuel was that massive 5-fold increase in global oil and gas prices. The revenue surge was just immense.
And they used that revenue.
They did. Russia was able to successfully repay all of its substantial Soviet-era debts by 2005. They even managed to gain entry into the World Trade Organization in 2012, which seemed like a moment of real international economic integration.
But then the political calculus shifted quite dramatically around 2004, marking that transition into the status period. Why the move away from market-oriented reform towards more state control?
Well, it seems the consolidation of political power, that vertical, was mirrored by a consolidation of economic power. The status period focused heavily on making sure the state controlled strategic sectors, energy, aerospace, defense.
How do they do that?
They formed these massive state champions, like the United Aircraft Corporation in 2006, and there was a really clear, non-negotiable emphasis on ensuring majority Russian state ownership in major joint ventures. Think of the 49-51 split that was established in the 2004 Gazprom Nord Stream pipeline deal.
So 51% state control.
Exactly. It guaranteed the Kremlin ultimate control over these strategic assets. It suggests political leverage was often prioritized over, say, pure profit maximization or efficiency.
Now, when the state becomes the primary economic actor like that, it often opens the door wide to corruption, which, as we noted earlier, seemed to be an issue even back in his St. Petersburg days.
It's an almost unavoidable connection, isn't it? Russia has consistently received, frankly, abysmal scores on the Global Corruption Perceptions Index throughout his rule. The whole system, resource wealth extraction, state-controlled industry became deeply intertwined with political loyalty and patronage networks.
Right.
It got so blatant that the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project actually named Putin their 2014 Person of the Year.
Not an award you'd want.
Good. It's infinitely not. And it wasn't for fighting corruption, but specifically for furthering corruption and organized crime on a global scale. That's how they saw it.
And what was the domestic perception of this system, even during those boom years when money was flowing?
Well, the sources indicate there was significant public frustration even then. A 2018 survey, for example, suggested that 2/3 of Russians believed Putin bore full responsibility for the problems of the country. So there's a clear irony. The economic success, largely built on that energy revenue, funded a political system that many of the very people it claimed to serve viewed as deeply corrupt.
Okay, moving into Section 4 then. If he's managing the economy manually, as Osland put it, he's certainly managing the national narrative with an equally tight ideological fist.
Oh, absolutely. Control over information is just paramount if you want to maintain that vertical of power. And the sources we have are pretty definitive on this. Since 1999, Putin has systematically punished journalists who dare to challenge the official state viewpoint.
Systematically punished.
Yeah, and we saw a major, clearly orchestrated crackdown on what little independent media was left, particularly after his return to the presidency in 2012.
How does Russia rank globally in terms of press freedom under his rule?
Very, very poorly. Reporters Without Borders ranked Russia 148th in their 2013 World Press Freedom Index. They classified the entire media environment as not free. And this isn't just about overt censorship. It's about actively engineering the information landscape that citizens are exposed to.
And what's the primary delivery mechanism for this managed narrative? Is it still TV?
Television remains absolutely king. Sources suggest approximately 2/3 of Russians use state-controlled television as their main news source. And around 85% get most of their information overall from Russian state media outlets.
And what's the narrative being pushed?
It's a very specific, powerful, and quite historical narrative. Essentially that Putin and his inner circle are akin to modern-day Romanov Tsars who heroically ended the post-Soviet chaos, the so-called time of troubles.
Right.
It presents him not just as a president, but as the indispensable national savior, the ultimate stabilizing force.
That media control must have become absolute following the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
It became effectively totalitarian when it came to the conflict. State media outlets were given explicit orders to use only official state sources. They were strictly banned from using critical, accurate terms like war, invasion, or aggression.
Instead, using special military operation.
Exactly. And the penalties for violating these war censorship laws are incredibly severe, up to 15 years in jail. It effectively silenced virtually all internal media dissent about the war.
Beyond just controlling the media, the entire ideological framework of the state seems to have shifted under his rule towards a very pronounced conservative turn.
Yes, it was a very systematic shift. He actively promotes explicitly conservative policies, both at home and internationally. He frequently launches these rhetorical attacks against globalism, liberalism, Western democratic norms.
And he backs this up.
He does. He has cultivated and supported conservative think tanks like the Izborsky Club, which really emphasize fervent Russian nationalism, traditionalism, and a systematic opposition to liberal ideas.
And a critical piece of cementing this ideological shift seems to have been the powerful alliance he forged with the Russian Orthodox Church.
That alliance is absolutely central. You see consistently close collaboration between the state and the Russian Orthodox Church, which of course gained immense prestige and influence after decades of Soviet repression.
And the church leadership reciprocated.
Oh, very much so. Patriarch Kirill, the head of the church, publicly endorsed Putin's 2012 election victory, actually proclaiming it a miracle of God. This kind of merging of state and church provides a powerful moral and historical justification for the government's conservative and nationalist direction.
Now, under this conservative banner, we've seen what many describe as a rapid erosion of civil liberties and human rights. What are some of the most restrictive laws that the sources highlight?
The sources detail several key ones. First, there's the restrictive foreign agents law. It's been expanded over the years, notably in 2020.
How does that work?
It forces any Russian human rights organizations, NGOs, even media outlets that receive any international funding to publicly brand themselves as foreign agents. This severely hinders their work, makes it hard to get funding or rent space, and basically brands them as subversive elements, spies almost.
And globally, perhaps the most controversial has been the legislation targeting the LGBTQ plus community.
That would be the infamous gay propaganda law, officially prohibiting the dissemination of propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations to minors.
And the impact.
Well, critics argue, and the sources support this, that the law has led directly to widespread censorship, severe restrictions on public life for LGBT plus people, and, worryingly, a documented increase in violence and discrimination against the community. It creates a climate of fear.
We also see, according to the sources, the systematic use of imprisonment to silence major political dissent, often targeting very high-profile opponents.
Yes, this is a consistent tactic described. You have high-profile figures like Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the oligarch who challenged Putin's authority early on and ended up in prison for years.
Right.
And more recently, Alexei Navalny, who became arguably his most effective and visible contemporary critic, who was imprisoned and ultimately died in custody.
And it's not just the figureheads.
No. As of 2020, the Memorial Human Rights Center, which itself was later shut down, listed 380 political prisoners in Russia. That number included 78 residents of annexed Crimea, illustrating the scope of this political suppression.
And finally, this conservative turn seems to be codified right into the state's most foundational documents and even applied to demographic policy.
Absolutely. Those 2020 constitutional amendments we mentioned earlier, they explicitly define marriage as exclusively between one man and one woman, cementing traditional values right into the Constitution.
And the demographics.
In 2023, reflecting this deep-seated concern over Russia's declining birth rates, Putin publicly urged Russian women to embrace their patriotic duty, essentially, and have 7, 8, or even more children.
Wow, 7 or 8.
It really paints a picture of a system geared towards locking down a very specific, traditional nationalist worldview, where even the citizens' personal life choices are framed as subservient to the state's demographic and ideological needs.
That intense domestic focus on traditionalism and control seems to translate directly into his often confrontational foreign policy. Which brings us neatly to Section 5. The fundamental principle governing that foreign policy seems to be this concept of the near abroad.
Yes, the near abroad concept is absolutely key to understanding Russian external relations under Putin. The Kremlin consistently asserts what it calls a sphere of influence and privileged interests over all the post-Soviet states.
Aye.
They argue these territories are just strategically vital to Russian security and core interests. They see them as a necessary buffer zone.
That assertion of privileged interests, it sounds strikingly familiar to certain historical Western policies, doesn't it?
It does. It's been frequently compared by geopolitical experts to the historical Monroe Doctrine, which the United States asserted over its hemisphere. This idea of preventing external influence in a claimed sphere of interest is what has led directly to conflict in the region.
Which specific conflicts have arisen directly from this asserted sphere of influence doctrine?
Well, most notably, we saw the 2008 Russo-Georgian War, which erupted after Georgia tried to reassert control over the breakaway region of South Ossetia. Russia intervened forcefully.
Okay.
And then, critically, the 2014 annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. Putin justified the annexation by claiming Crimea has always been and remains an inseparable part of Russia.
And his justification regarding Ukraine itself?
He asserted, quite controversially and ahistorically, according to many historians, that Ukraine itself was artificially created on a whim by the Bolsheviks, basically denying its legitimacy as a truly independent nation separate from Russia.
So the core conflict, the full-scale 2022 invasion of Ukraine, was preceded by years of this intense ideological justification and some pretty explicit warnings. What did the sources reveal about that ideological buildup?
The ideological groundwork was laid quite meticulously over years. Way back in 2014, during the armed insurgency in eastern Ukraine, Putin had already stated publicly that he would use Russia's entire arsenal of available means to protect Russian speakers abroad.
Establishing a pretext.
Essentially, yes. It established a potential justification for intervention anywhere he claimed Russian speakers were threatened.
But the most profound statement, the one that really stands out, was that 2021 article that was made mandatory reading for Russian military personnel.
Yes, that lengthy July 2021 article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. The fact it was made mandatory reading really underscores its strategic importance in the Kremlin's view.
And what did it argue?
In it, Putin explicitly stated that the very formation of a Ukrainian state hostile to Moscow was comparable in threat level to the use of weapons of mass destruction against Russia.
Wow, comparable to WMDs.
It frames Ukrainian sovereignty not just as an inconvenience or a geopolitical challenge, but as an existential military-grade threat that justifies extreme measures.
Looking at the invasion context itself, we now have Putin's own recent commentary reflecting on the decision to launch it.
His statements in December 2023 were highly revealing, I think. He indicated that Russia would only negotiate when its stated objectives were completely achieved, essentially confirming a maximalist position, no compromise.
Right.
But perhaps the most striking comment was his expression of regret. Not regret for starting the war,
But
regret that he did not launch the invasion earlier and with more preparation. He stated it was, quote, impossible to stand still and endure any longer. This really confirms the long-term, deeply ideological nature of the conflict from his perspective.
okay, let's turn now to the relationship with the West, specifically the U.S. and NATO, and the often chilling reliance on nuclear posturing. Relations seemed to start okay, cautiously after 9/11, but they collapsed pretty rapidly.
That's right. Initially, post 9/11, Russia did provide some intelligence support to the U.S. in the early days of the War on Terror. But that cooperation just evaporated quickly after 2003.
Why then?
Primarily driven by Russia's vehement opposition to the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, which they saw as illegal unilateralism. And perhaps even more crucially, the continued expansion of NATO eastward, closer and closer to Russia's borders. This profound deterioration really reached a boiling point in 2007.
Ah, yes. That was a landmark Munich Security Conference speech. What was the essence of Putin's argument there? It made huge waves.
It was a full-throated, global condemnation of U.S. foreign policy delivered right in the heart of the Western security establishment. Putin criticized what he explicitly called the United States' monopolistic dominance.
Meaning?
He argued the U.S. was engaged in the almost uncontained hyper-use of force in international relations, basically, acting unilaterally, ignoring international law and institutions. He argued this meant no one feels safe, and ironically, this U.S. policy was succeeding only in stimulating a new global arms race.
A clear declaration that the post-Cold War unipolar moment was over, in his view.
Absolutely. It was a signal that Russia would no longer accept that order. And the nuclear rhetoric quickly followed suit, framing Russia's own military modernization, especially its nuclear forces, as a necessary response to perceived threats.
What specific threats?
The Kremlin consistently argues that Russia has been forced to modernize its nuclear capabilities, primarily because the U.S. withdrew from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile (ABM) treaty back in 2002.
Right.
Russia viewed that withdrawal as fundamentally undermining its strategic deterrent, its ability to strike back if attacked. This strategic posturing led to his notorious 2018 statement about a potential nuclear conflict.
Martyrs quote.
Yes, an aggressor should know that vengeance is inevitable, that he will be annihilated. We, meaning Russians, will go to heaven as martyrs. It's a shocking framing, really, turning the concept of mutual assured destruction into some kind of moral or even religious victory.
And that escalation, that nuclear brinkmanship, has only continued into the present decade, hasn't it?
It has. In 2023, Russia suspended its participation in the New START Treaty, the last major nuclear arms reduction treaty with the United States.
Suspending, not withdrawing entirely, but still.
Still a major blow to arms control. Furthermore, in September 2024, Putin issued a really severe warning, stating that Russia would consider nuclear retaliation even if it were attacked only with conventional weapons.
That sounds like a shift.
Experts noted it as a very worrying apparent deviation from Russia's traditional, although somewhat opaque, doctrine, which generally reserved nuclear use for existential threats or nuclear attack. It lowered the threshold, potentially.
This tension with Western allies has played out not just in grand policy statements, but through specific lethal incidents on the soil of allied nations, particularly, it seems, in the UK.
Yes, the sources detail two extremely high-profile poisonings that UK authorities linked directly back to the Russian state. First, back in 2006, the poisoning of the former KGB FSB officer Alexander Litvinenko in London.
With polonium, right?
Using radioactive polonium-210, yes, a truly exotic and state-level method.
And the official UK inquiry drew a pretty clear line of responsibility, didn't it?
It did. The 2016 UK public inquiry concluded that the FSB operation to kill Litvinenko was probably approved by Mr. Patrushev, then head of the FSB, and also by President Putin.
And the motive.
The inquiry cited Litvinenko's very public and damaging criticisms of the Kremlin leadership and the FSB itself as the likely motive, sending a message.
Then the second major incident involved a nerve agent.
That was the 2018 Novichok poisoning of Sergei Skripal, a former Russian military intelligence officer who had been a double agent for the UK, and his daughter Yulia in Salisbury.
Novichok, another state signature.
Exactly. A military-grade nerve agent developed by the Soviet Union. The UK formally accused the Russian state, and the Foreign Secretary at the time, Boris Johnson, stated publicly that it was overwhelmingly likely Putin himself had personally ordered the attack.
So these incidents, they underscore a willingness to use lethal, clandestine force against perceived traitors, even on Allied soil. It seems aimed at maintaining internal discipline and projecting a kind of ruthless external deterrence.
That's certainly how many analysts interpret them.
Now, while the relationship with the West has been so confrontational, Putin has simultaneously been busy building powerful global partnerships, particularly looking eastward and also into the Middle East.
Yes, this is the very calculated eastward pivot. Russia has cultivated increasingly strong strategic relationships, especially with China and India. They work through organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and the BRICS economic grouping.
And the tangible results.
Massive infrastructural cooperation is one key outcome. The prime example is the huge $400 billion Power of Siberia natural gas pipeline deal signed with China. It locks in long-term energy supply to China, providing Russia with revenue and political leverage in exchange for China's diplomatic backing.
What about regions traditionally seen as more under Western influence, like the Middle East and Africa? Has Russia made inroads there?
Systematically. Russia has sought to undermine what it sees as the U.S.-led international order by expanding its influence in these areas. Putin visited Iran back in 2007, the first Soviet or Russian leader to do so since Stalin went for the Tehran Conference in 1943.
That's significant.
It is. And he publicly condemned the 2011 NATO-led military intervention in Libya, calling it medieval calls for crusades, deliberately framing Western actions as aggressive, imperialistic overreach.
And the most significant military move outside the post-Soviet space was undoubtedly Syria, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The direct military intervention in Syria starting in 2015 to prop up the Bashar al-Assad regime was a major geopolitical move from Moscow's perspective.
What were the aims?
It seems it was explicitly aimed at undermining the U.S.-led coalition fighting ISIS, preventing regime change, and critically securing permanent Russian influence in the eastern Mediterranean. They solidified their presence using bases like the Tartus naval base. It showed Russia was willing and able to project power far beyond its borders again.
And in Africa, the strategy seems to have involved establishing quieter, sometimes deniable, military footholds.
Yes, often using private military companies, PMCs, like the Wagner Group, though their status is now complex. Moscow dispatched Russian PMCs to various conflicts, notably securing a significant, almost permanent military presence by intervening decisively in the Central African Republic's civil war.
Right.
And the first ever Russia-Africa summit was held in 2019, highlighting the strategic priority Moscow placed on establishing resource extraction deals and security relationships across the continent, often filling vacuums left by former colonial powers or competing directly with Western influence.
Okay, let's pivot now to our final section, Section 6, Public Image, Wealth, and Historical Assessment. The persona Putin presents to the world is so fundamental to his domestic support, and it appears incredibly curated.
Oh, it's textbook cult of personality construction, meticulously designed to project this image of the strongman, the Vosht, the father of the nation.
How was that achieved?
It involves these highly publicized, often quite macho, tough guy photo opportunities and stunts. We've all seen them. The photos of him shirtless while fishing or riding a horse in Siberia.
Right, the submersible dive.
Diving in a tiny submersible in Lake Baikal, driving a Formula One car, demonstrating his skills in martial arts, he holds an 8th Dan black belt in judo, which is very high. This carefully crafted image is meant to scream strength, competence, decisiveness, control.
And this image of physical strength is often coupled with a very distinctive, quite sharp communicative style, isn't it?
Absolutely. He's known for using these pithy aphorisms, memorable sound bites, and sometimes surprisingly coarse or vulgar language.
Like the criminal jargon.
Yes. Notably, he occasionally employs Russian criminal jargon known as penya. This linguistic choice, sort of speaking the language of the street, is widely interpreted as a deliberate move to connect with a broader, perhaps traditionally tougher segment of the population. It adds this layer of perceived authenticity, maybe even danger, to his otherwise polished public image.
And internationally, this carefully cultivated image has brought him immense, if often controversial, recognition over the years.
Significant recognition, yes. He was named Time Magazine's Person of the Year back in 2007, and Forbes magazine ranked him as the world's most powerful individual for 4 consecutive years, from 2013 to 2016.
But it's controversial recognition.
Definitely. The controversy is perhaps best encapsulated by that term that emerged in Germany, Putinmörster.
Meaning?
Literally, one who understands Putin. It became a derogatory political buzzword used to criticize politicians or public figures who seemed to advocate for greater empathy or understanding of the Kremlin's motives, seen by critics as appeasement.
Now, the public persona is of this man of relatively modest means, dedicated solely to serving the state. But the question of his actual private wealth is one of the most explosive and certainly most opaque elements surrounding his rule.
The contrast is truly astonishing. It almost screams cognitive dissonance. Officially, his reported income is quite modest, for example, the equivalent of about $270,000 back in 2012. Yet, he's been photographed numerous times wearing luxury wristwatches with a collective value estimated by journalists at around $700,000. That's nearly 3 times his official annual salary just on his wrist.
Right.
And the allegations from opposition figures, investigative journalists, and Western intelligence agencies about his true wealth are just staggering. Estimates of a secret multi-billion-dollar fortune go as high as $160 billion, maybe even more, though proving it is incredibly difficult.
So how does one reconcile that level of visible personal luxury, like the watches, with the carefully crafted image of the dedicated state servant? The sources seem to suggest it's all hidden behind this complex network of proxies.
That is the core finding, really, from those major offshore financial leaks, the Panama Papers in 2016, the Pandora Papers in 2021. They linked very close personal associates of Putin.
Like who?
People like the cellist Sergei Roldugin, a childhood friend, and the Rotenberg brothers, his former judo partners. These leaks connected them to billions of dollars held in complex offshore structures. Specifically, about $2 billion just in Roldugin's network was identified.
And Roldugin himself claimed he wasn't really a businessman. Yet somehow he accumulated assets worth maybe $100 million. It strongly suggests a classic proxy system, doesn't it?
It certainly implies, according to the investigators, a systematic use of proxies, trusted friends, family members, associates, to shield the true beneficial owner of these vast funds. It effectively hides the wealth from public scrutiny, from potential international sanctions, and allows him to maintain that relatively austere public image while allegedly controlling assets valued in the billions.
And this alleged secrecy extends even to his residences, far beyond the official government compounds like the Kremlin or Novogoryovo.
Absolutely. While he uses numerous official government residences, critics and investigative reports point to these incredibly controversial, allegedly personal estates. The most famous, of course, is that massive Italianate-style palace complex near Gelendzhik on the Black Sea coast.
Often called Putin's Palace.
Exactly. Estimated to have cost something like $1.35 billion to build. Alexei Navalny's investigative team released a hugely popular documentary claiming this colossal structure was built through an intricate corruption scheme specifically for Putin's personal, private use. They argued it's the physical manifestation of his secret wealth and power. The Kremlin denies it, of course.
Finally, then, how is his legacy being assessed, both critically and supportively, now that we are well over 2 decades into his rule?
The assessments are, as you'd expect, profoundly divided. Internationally, the critical voices are incredibly harsh, especially now. Freedom House, as we mentioned, has rated Russia not free since 2005. Post-2022 invasion, world leaders have used exceptionally stark language. Joe Biden, Justin Trudeau, Boris Johnson have all labeled him things like a lying, murderous dictator and a bully. Hillary Clinton, even before that, characterized him simply as arrogant.
But inside Russia, particularly perhaps among older generations, the assessment often remains strongly supportive, doesn't it?
Yes, many Russians genuinely credit him, or at least did for a long time, for reviving Russia's fortunes. They argue he restored order, national pride, and economic stability after the perceived chaos and national humiliation of the Yeltsin years in the 1990s.
Right.
Even the former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, who is often critical of Putin's democratic backsliding, publicly stated at one point that Putin had saved Russia from the beginning of a collapse during that initial period. He brought stability at a cost.
Looking now towards the longer view, how do contemporary historians or analysts frame his overall impact on the world stage?
Well, a recent assessment, I think it was Franklin Foer writing for a 2025 publication, declared quite starkly that the world is now living in the age of Vladimir Putin.
The age of Putin.
His argument was that Putin's greatest, most lasting success was fundamentally shattering the post-Cold War transatlantic order, the idea of American unipolarity. He succeeded in challenging U.S. dominance, promoting his alternative model of strongman conservatism and sovereign nationalism, and fueling a global turn, or at least a questioning, against liberal democracy. Foer argues he has fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape regardless of what happens next.
So the detailed journey we've taken today, drawing on all these sources, it really shows this clear, perhaps terrifying pattern from a KGB officer steeped in secrecy through that incredibly rapid political ascent marked by consolidating power, the vertical and economic realignment based on state control, often fueled by resource wealth, to a foreign policy rooted in reclaiming spheres of influence and confronting the West. The sources seem to synthesize a leader whose political success at home and confrontation abroad were enabled in large part by that resource wealth, all wrapped up in this public image of carefully cultivated masculine strength.
And that profound tension, that gap between the visible strength and the invisible alleged power and wealth, that leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener.
Okay.
This man built his entire public image on projecting transparency, control, masculine strength. Yet his actual power, and certainly his alleged multi-billion-dollar wealth, seem guarded by unparalleled state secrecy, elaborate proxy networks, and what critics describe as deep-rooted systemic corruption.
So the question is,
to what extent is the authoritarian structure Putin built complete with the pervasive cult of personality, the massive unconfirmed wealth seemingly held by associates? To what extent is this simply the modern, personalized expression of a deeply rooted Russian historical tradition of highly centralized, secretive state power? Or is it something different? Is it a unique, personalized dictatorship designed specifically to make the man himself, Vladimir Putin, completely indistinguishable from the state he commands?
a question I suspect that the world will be wrestling with long after the age of Putin is officially declared over. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.